Hello there, you're watching the press preview, a first look at what's on the front pages as they arrive. And in the next half hour, we'll see what's making the headlines with the journalist and author, Rachel Shabi, and the leader writer for the Daily Telegraph, Tim Stanley. Welcome, both of you. Thanks so much for joining us on this Saturday evening. Let's take a look then and see what's on the front of a lot of those papers. Well, the Prime Minister is under mounting pressure to rethink plans to relax COVID rules on Monday due to the threat posed by the Indian variant. The Telegraph reports that the government's aim to vaccinate 1 million people a day in efforts to beat the Indian variant of COVID-19 could save the summer. That story is also on the front page of the Sunday Express. Serial killer Rose West's daughter has told the Sunday Mirror that her mother is the key to unlocking the circumstances surrounding the disappearance of Mary Bastholm, believed to be one of Fred West's victims. Footballer Marcus Rashford has broken up with his childhood sweetheart, according to The Sun. And in anticipation of the relaxation of coronavirus restrictions next week, the Star has turned to Starsky and Hutch star Huggy Bear, just in case you've forgotten how to hug. Perish the thought. We're joined tonight by Rachel Shabi and Tim Stanley. Thanks again for joining us, guys. And The Observer is the one we're going to kick off with. Rachel, Boris Johnson must think again on plans to relax COVID rules. A certain amount of pressure that he's facing and questions about whether or not the timing is right to start relaxing the regulations.
Well, that's right. It seems that his own scientific advisors are concerned about the relaxations of lockdown restrictions that we're going to see on Monday. It seems that their particular concern is the easing of restrictions around pubs, and they worry that young people in particular will be vulnerable to a surge in infections and consequently a surge in hospital cases and hospitals being overwhelmed in the way that we saw earlier this year. Much of this is to do with concerns over the India variant, and it's now known that 20,000 passengers came from India to the UK in that period when Boris Johnson delayed putting India on that red list, that travel ban. It now seems that he was delaying that because he wanted to go and visit India to see Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, to talk about a deal, so a trade deal that he thinks that the UK needs after Brexit. And that was what the delay was about. But it seems that his advisors are saying to him, the idea of pubs reopening is perhaps not a good idea, and they want to see restrictions. They're particularly worried about the region of the Northwest, and they want to see restrictions maintained either in that region specifically or just nationwide for at least another month.
And Tim, in the Sunday Telegraph, we're hearing from some Conservative MPs, Steve Baker, so the pressure is on the Prime Minister from within his own camp to reconsider about the speed of the relaxations.
Boris Johnson said on Friday that because of the emergence of the Indian variant, there's a possibility that the race between Britain vaccinating and the spread of the virus might begin to tighten. Now, there are two logical responses to that. One, as the Observer reports, as some scientific advisors are saying, one is to slow the rate at which you unlock to keep certain restrictions in place, possibly even have local lockdowns like we experimented with late last year. The other logical step is to intensify your vaccination program so that even as the Indian variant spreads, because we are vaccinating much larger numbers of people at a much faster rate, we stay one step ahead of it. Now, the government is hoping that at some point it'll hit a target of vaccinating 1 million people a day. Not impossible. A few days ago, Germany pulled off a European record by vaccinating 1.1 million people in one day, and the government seems to believe it has the stockpiles to do it. This itself raises other strategic questions. One is, who do you rush to vaccinate? Do you rush to get out the second dose for older people who've had the first dose? Or do you start to concentrate doses on younger people, which seems to be the cohort among which the Indian variant is spreading? So there's going to be a big debate in the next few days as we open up on Monday. Do we slow down unlocking? Do we intensify vaccinations? Do we do both? But either way, the Indian variant has definitely forced the government to have a big conversation about the way forward.
And on the front of the Sunday Express, Rachel, it says it in massive font, which to me shouts, panic! It says, we can't afford to panic. I mean,
Yes.
do you think there is a fear that we will panic?
It's a somewhat self-defeating, panicked headline, isn't it? I think you're right about that. Look, there's a difference between panic and just being sensible and cautious. You know, to me, it makes sense to be more cautious in the short term so that, you know, we can ease up properly in the long term. I feel, for myself personally, I would rather delay restrictions easing for a few weeks now if it means that we can absolutely get on top of this situation in a few months down the line. So I do think that, you know, that it's not necessarily a particularly helpful headline. And I think there are still plenty of reasons to be cautious. We might find that sort of percolating among the population, but also, you know, we do need to keep talking about the government being late to respond to things. It's incredible to me that this far into the pandemic, it's still responding too late and too slow to advice from its own scientists. But also we need to be looking at, if we are easing lockdown restrictions, we definitely need to ramp up test and trace. Again, billions spent on that to private contractors who are not up to the job. The tracing element particularly is not working in the way that it should, and people are not being given the financial means to isolate if they need to. So those elements are still not in place a year down the line, and you have to wonder why not, because these are the sort of things that are going to allow us to ease restrictions in the way that we all want to.
Do you think that's a fair comment, Tim, that actually, you know, if people are concerned about putting bread on the table, that they are going to be a lot more reluctant to have tests if they think they could potentially be at risk, or indeed report them if they have any symptoms?
Oh, sure. I think there's always been a risk of that. I would say stick to the timetable as much as possible. Partly for the economic reasons and also the welfare reasons of people getting psychologically used to things unlocking, and it would be a tremendous shock if they didn't unlock. But also there are many businesses right now which really are on a knife edge. They've not been functioning at full capacity. From Monday, they can move towards doing that. We're not just talking restaurants and bars. On Monday, you also see cinemas and theatres reopen. And the idea that those might have to shut would just be absolutely devastating. There is a cost to lockdown. There is obviously a cost of the pandemic spreading. No one's denying that. Of course there is. It's measured in mortality. But there is also a human and economic cost to sustaining the lockdown for much longer. Plus, there is alternative there is alternative scientific advice. There are some scientists who are saying, don't panic. Partly because the Indian variant, it looks like, does spread faster. But there isn't yet a proven link between that faster spread and a rise in hospitalizations. And that's what really matters. It is possible, and this is looking at on the brighter side, it is possible that a fast spread among young people is a sign of the success of the vaccination program, that sufficient numbers of older people have been vaccinated that they're not catching this thing. And although young people can suffer from COVID-19, of course they can, they are much less likely to suffer from it, much less likely to end up in hospital. So there is an argument against overreacting and against extending lockdown. And the Prime Minister's got to weigh up those two different sources of advice. And I personally, if I was speaking to him, would say, do your damn best to stick to the June deadline, because the country really wants to reopen. And I think it's time it started to.
Let's move away from COVID and on to another story which also has an enormous human and economic cost. And Rachel, this is on the front of the Observer, marked in a lot of the other papers, what's going on between the Israelis and the Palestinians at the moment. It's distressing on all sides, isn't it?
It's absolutely distressing and heartbreaking to see the situation. There's been protests around the world in outrage at Israel's assaults on Gaza, some 150,000 people in London alone, but that has been happening globally. And of course, there is just no justification for the terrorizing assault being carried out on Gaza right now. We have to remember that Gaza is sealed off. That it is a population of 2 million people under siege. There is nowhere for them to go. Gaza is sealed off, so they are sitting targets. And today alone, Israeli forces have attacked a refugee camp. They've killed 8 cousins from the same family, children who were just celebrating Eid al-Fitr, the holiday to mark the end of Ramadan. And it has also struck a building containing both Al Jazeera English and Associated Press, which obviously is absolutely something that we should all be united in condemning, an attack on international media. So it's very distressing to watch these images, and we just have to keep in mind that this is completely disproportionate use of force against a population that doesn't have an army, they don't have a navy, they don't have an air force, they have no way of defending themselves, no shelter, no Iron Dome. They are sitting targets and they are currently being terrorized.
However, Rachel, those living inside Israel who have also been the subject of bomb attacks coming from Hamas rockets coming from Gaza up to the Tel Aviv area, and we know that there haven't been as many deaths, but there have been a handful of deaths on the Israeli side, will say that they too are living in terror. And Tim, one element of what seems to have changed over the last few days is that it's actually people inside Israel, Arab Israelis and Arab Jews, who are also now fighting. And that is an incredibly worrying development, isn't it? That it seems to be pitting communities that were living side by side in relative harmony against each other.
Yes, which poses difficult questions about the future of Israel and how and whether or not it can prosper in its current state. I mean, you've put it very well. Rachel has very articulately and convincingly explained what's happened to the people of Gaza. But you're right to provide some balance and say there has also been over 2,000 rockets fired from Gaza into Israel. And if Israel did not have the Iron Dome protecting its civilians, I'm sure many more hundreds of Israelis would have died as well. I always feel like a complete chump saying it's a complicated situation, because that sounds like I'm dodging the moral responsibility to say what can be done or what should be done. But the reality, it is complicated. It's made even more complicated by local politics, by Hamas struggling for control over the Palestinian people with Fatah. There were supposed to be some elections. Fatah cancelled them. That might be one motivating factor for Hamas to behave in this way. It also has links to Iran, which are very troubling. Likewise, within Israel, Netanyahu was in trouble before this crisis, and this crisis strengthens his position politically. Yeah. So what that all amounts to is it's very difficult to see where those who are currently in charge and claim to speak for either side, where they will give ground.
Welcome back. You're watching the Press Preview with me now, Rachel Shabi and Tim Stanley. And the Telegraph has a story on its front page, Tim, about museum board seats that they're going to start handing them over to, well, they're describing them as red wall voters. Essentially, that they're suggesting that gruff northerners will be less woke than the metropolitan elites that many museums have on their boards.
Well, they might very well have a point. The government is going ahead with its culture war. It's not backing down on this stuff. And Oliver Dowden, the cultural secretary, has said that, as you've described it, museums and other trusts must have a greater national representation on their boards, not just for the sake of diversity and representation, but also because they think it means that those sorts of people will say no to political fads like taking down statues or renaming things. Another critical element of the story, by the way, and I quote it here, is Robert Jenrick, the community secretary, will amend building regulations so that buildings used by the public must have separate ladies' and gents' lavatories in the future. That's quite a significant development, actually. Again, culture war stuff, government's taking a stance against unisex toilets there, and is going to ensure that in the future, public buildings will have to provide facilities separately for men and women.
Very interesting. Rachel, we literally have 10 seconds, but why should we be referring to Starsky and Hutch over the next few days?
Because they think that the Daily Star thinks we've forgotten how to hug. So it's brought out Huggy Bear from Starsky and Hutch to remind us. But I don't think we have, really. I think we've got a sort of muscle memory of how hugging works. I think we're going to be fine.
And we also have an excuse to not hug people we don't particularly want to. Rachel and Tim, thank you both so much. We'll get a lot more from you in half an hour. Thank you very much.